You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You can make this possible.
The young voters have played a critical role in many of our elections. That is no different than, of course, the 2020 election. What's going to be happening in 2020? And that is young voters are going to play the critical role in that midterm election. So Roland Martin, the founding partner of Hit Strategies, he's been talking to these voters. Let's hear what they have to say. Terrance, welcome back to Roland Martin Unfiltered.
What's up, Roland? Thanks for having me back, brother. How you doing?
Doing great. So let's talk about the election. We get, as you keep moving forward, younger voters will play an even bigger role. What are you seeing? What are you hearing about what happened in 2022?
You know, Roland, young voters are becoming not just the biggest voting bloc in America, but they remain the most diverse voting bloc in America. 37% of voters in 2020 were under the age of 39. That's the millennials. That's Gen Z. But again, what's unique about them is the diversity within this generation. We hear a lot from Democrats and from other politicians talking about removing identity politics and turning towards economic issues. The truth is, Roland, for young people, their identities are their politics. You know, they lead with issues like immigration, with issues that are central, like racism, which is the number one issue across all races of young people. Racism and discrimination has emerged as a top issue. So that's really what's shaping their political identities and shaping their political participation. And that started, Roland, in 2020 during those protests following George Floyd's death, where we saw the protest following George Floyd's death. The complexion of those protests began to change, and they began to look a lot more ethnically diverse. The majority of protesters after George Floyd's death were actually young white people. And so that's really what we're starting to see shape up here, and understanding how to speak to those priorities is going to be critical if Democrats want to hold power in 2022.
A clear-cut Democrat-Republican thing. Obviously, when you look at issues and you have these voters who say they may not turn out. Their deal is, look, if I'm not being satisfied, I may stay at home. So what should candidates be saying to reach them? What should they be saying to touch them?
Well, first thing we have to do is we got to disaggregate a little bit, right? Young voters are very diverse. So that you got Gen Z and millennials, and there's a lot of difference there. But ethnically, when you look at young voters, we really got to start looking at young voters of color very, very differently than we look at young white voters. There's this perception, Roland, that young voters are much more progressive, that even young white voters are much more progressive. And while they align with Democrats on a lot of the issues, on climate, on student loans, on the need for police reform, when you start looking at disaggregating them by race, young white voters are participating politically a lot more like white voters than like young voters. And so when we're talking to this younger generation, we have to keep
the operative word is still white.
That's right.
The word is still white.
That's exactly right. And so the truth is that the young white voters aren't significantly more progressive. There's just significantly less of them in this generation because it's so diverse. And so when you look at a state like Georgia, 60% of white voters under the age of 30 voted for Donald Trump. But 67% of white voters overall in Georgia voted for Donald Trump. And so young white voters, again, are operating a lot more like white than they are like young.
And so, and that's why I think there's this effort on the part of folks to say, oh, well, we've got, young voters. I'm like, no, you can't just say young. You got to keep that focus on, no, they may be young, but but which and
That's
I
right.
think also what has to happen is folks have to also dig a little bit deeper. Even when you start talking about Black voters, Latino voters, you can't just sort of stop there. Now you got to start saying, their income level, what part of the country they're from, all of that. And campaigns are going to, and this is what I think really is going to be the big deal here. Campaigns are going to have to do even more micro targeting.
That's
So
right.
there's sort of this broad brush. No, that's not going to do it. You're gonna have to do a different type of campaigning to get them to turn out in 2022.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Roland. And it starts right now. When we look across some of these issue priorities amongst millennials, we see that they really do prioritize some of those kitchen table issues, jobs and wages, the cost of healthcare. But when you look at the younger generation, Gen Z, they still prioritize a lot of social issues, immigration and racism. And so again, like you said, we have to start micro messaging here and really talking to the priorities of these individual groups. You and I, Roland, have talked a lot about not just the gender gaps amongst Black voters, but also the generational gaps amongst Black voters. And so we really do have to start acknowledging some of these differences, understanding not just by demographic or by cutting them up along these turf lines that campaigns like to do for canvassing, but understanding the values and the priorities of these voters and speaking to that in a real way. Look, Democrats have a razor-thin margin in the Senate and the House. They don't have a margin in the Senate. Kamala Harris is the margin in the Senate. And so we really got to start that work right now if they're going to mobilize the largest and most diverse voting bloc in America.
Questions from our panel. First off, Avis, your questions for Terrance.
So you mentioned that young white voters are really, in essence, white voters. Let's just focus on that. But what I find was interesting, so this past year, I've been involved with the Black Women's Roundtable survey that we do with Essence annually. And one of the things that we've been noticing in recent years is when you look at Black voters, and particularly Black women, that's who we focus on, that younger Black women are actually more likely to start to be more diverse in terms of their political leanings, meaning that they're much less likely to be clumped, quote unquote, in the Democratic category, and instead are more likely to be interested in looking at independence as an independent leaning, or maybe even Republican more than their older counterparts. And so with those trends, first of all, is that applicable with other young people of color? And if so, what can that tell us in terms of the overall direction of young voters? Is it that they're quite really not nearly as progressive as we think, not just in terms of white voters, but as it regards to voters of colors and specifically of Black voters too?
That's a great question. And, I mentioned the gender gap between Black voters, where Black men are slightly less likely to support Democratic candidates, slightly less likely to personally identify as Democrats. But the same gap exists amongst the generationally, that young Black voters have less loyalty to the Democratic Party, less affinity to Democratic candidates, and are less and quite frankly are more likely to consider and to support Republicans. But the differences are important. For the gender gap, Black men are more likely to support Republicans because they are in fact more conservative on some issues. But for younger generations, it's not because they're more conservative. When we talk to young Black voters in focus groups, the reason they are less likely to support Democrats and more likely to consider Republicans, it is punitive. It is frustration and cynicism toward the Democratic Party, and what they would consider a herd mentality. And so they are willing to consider options. And that is why Democrats do, in fact, have to start treating young Black voters and Black male voters as a persuasion audience. What have you done lately is a question that young Black people bring to the voting booth.
Julian?
I'm shaking my head because I'm thinking about what you're saying, especially around what Democrats promise and what they don't deliver. The Biden-Harris ticket promised higher minimum wages, student loan recovery or forgiveness, and now they're doing the Mr. Bojangles thing where they haven't done that. Meanwhile, Republicans have not promised Black people anything. So how I understand why many young voters are disillusioned, but what have Republicans done to make them feel affinity?
Absolutely. So two things to respond to there. One is what the Biden-Harris administration has and has not done. Recognizing that the Biden administration has been in office for less than 90 days, but they do have an exceptional approval rating amongst young black voters. Joe Biden has a 61% approval rating, which is exceptional and significantly higher than the 18% approval rating that Donald Trump had with the same group. But the Biden-Harris administration is going to have to spend just as much time marketing what they do as they spend governing, right? For young black voters, the single most important issue is racism and discrimination. But if I focus group 10 random young black voters from across America right now, they don't know about the Racial Justice Task Force that Susan Rice stood up within a week of the Biden-Harris administration. We can debate about the teeth that task force has, but there's no debate about whether or not it is significantly more progress than Republicans have made. Because on the flip side of that is exactly what Donald Trump spent the last year of his term doing, which was marketing his perceived wins to the black community. Those same black voters that I recruit into that focus group, they can tell you that Donald Trump had the lowest unemployment rate amongst black people. They can tell you about the First Step Act. I am not saying that those are accomplishments that had significant impacts on the black community. I am saying that those young black voters know about those accomplishments. And that's where the Democratic Party has to get creative and aggressive about how they talk about what they have done. I mean, today we just passed a bill that has $29 billion in rent assistance, that has child credits for every child in the house. These are things that will have significant impacts in the black community, but that we need a marketing plan to tell people how their lives are improving because of the work that the Biden-Harris administration is doing.
Terrance, I got one more question from our panelists. Go right ahead, Makongo.
Yes, I was wondering, first of all, your research is amazing, and thank you for that. The number that stood out the most for me was 38 million. You said there were 38 million young people that were unreached by either party. And so kind of following up on your last question, when you talk about the marketing, what does that look like? Is it more social media? Have they tried social media, but that's just not effective? They got to move to new platforms. What does that look like in terms of reaching that demographic?
I mean, it is social media, and Barack Obama really did pioneer democratic efforts of reaching disenfranchised and disaffected communities using the internet, specifically to raise a ton of money. AOC and a lot of other young politicians are still using it in very effective ways. But so are misinformation and disinformation campaigns that have begun to use social media more aggressively and more surgically to target the most disaffected voters. If you all remember, Republicans had a stay home campaign during the 2020 campaign that was not geared at converting young voters of color to Republicans. It was geared at keeping them from voting. And when voters are already cynical, when they already have questions about whether or not politics affects their lives, then that misinformation is effective. And it was a young black man in Florida who said to me, my hood didn't get, in a focus group in Florida a few months before Election Day, he said, my hood didn't get any better under Obama. It hasn't got any worse under Trump. So tell me what any of these presidents got to do with me. And so until the Biden-Harris administration, until Democrats in Congress and Senate can explain to that young black man how his life is getting better because of the things that they're doing every day, then we can expect them to remain disaffected and keep on fighting over the existing voters in the electorate as opposed to activating that sleeping force of power that is 38 million young voters that stayed on the sideline in 2020.
All right. Terrance Woodbury, we so appreciate it, man. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Roland. Always a pleasure.
All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just 1 moment.
It's time to be smart. When we control our institutions, we win. This is the most important news show on television of any racial background. Y'all put $2, $3, $4, $5, $10, $15, $20, $30 on this and keep this going. What you've done, Roland, since this crisis came out in full bloom. Anybody watching this, tell your friends. Go back and look at the last 2 weeks, especially of Roland Martin Unfiltered. I mean, hell, go back and look at the last 2 days. You've had sitting United States senators today, Klobuchar and Harris. Whatever you have that you can bring to Roland Martin Unfiltered to support it, please do, because this information may literally save your life.
Watch Roland Martin Unfiltered daily at 6 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope, or go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered Daily Digital Show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.